So yeah, we're going to be talking about AppSec programs, real maturity. This talk is going to be split into two parts, the first of which is about application security programs in general. So if you look at the evolution of a security program, the beginning of a security program would generally start at what we're calling a low security maturity program. These programs may have little to no security expertise on the team, yet despite that, they may have an overinflated sense of what their security posture is. They might, keyword might, perform some security assessment related work, but the value there may be limited, it may be unrealized. It's kind of hard to say what that actually means to the program. Additionally, metrics and coverage measurements may be fairly sparse if they exist at all. And if they do exist, they might not be very meaningful. But over time, these programs might improve and approach what we're calling medium security maturity. So here, a medium security maturity program may not hire dedicated application security people or security people, but they may be looking at, say, engineers with a security mindset, or are interested in maybe hiring a third-party contractor to come in and do some security activities. And generally, in terms of coverage and metrics, their concerns might be, hey, hopefully they don't find too many bugs, or hey, so long as we don't have any bugs in the OWASP top 10, we're solid. So an important difference here between the low security maturity program and the medium security maturity program is the medium security maturity program has gotten a handle on some of the more tactical aspects of a security program, but they're still not focusing on the big picture. So a program that is looking towards the big picture might be the high maturity program, where you have dedicated team members working on security activities throughout the SDLC, and the program would have a good sense, an actual decent sense of its of its capabilities and deficiencies, and processes within that program are scalable, they're well defined, they're repeatable, and consistent. So an important aspect to a high maturity security program is a dedicated AppSec team or a dedicated security team. So drilling into that a little bit, we've looked at how we view AppSec teams and broken out about 4 different roles that we think an AppSec team might take on. The first 2 are going to be the lower level roles, so the analyst and the engineer. These 2 roles collectively would be responsible for identifying security defects in software or products. They would be managing that bug lifecycle workflow in the things they find. Maybe they're handling third-party vulnerability reports and that lifecycle as well. Really, they're the bug finders and the bug managers. Slightly above that, we have a role like a security architect whose sole focus is product-related concerns. So security architect might be working with product on new features and doing that early stage, pre-implementation security review design work. And also possibly working with software architects early on into implementation. And then finally, the highest level role we have listed here is a governance and compliance lead. The governance and compliance lead would be responsible for managing the program, as well as measuring program maturity over time. So a theme between low and high security maturity is going to be, for us, more tactical work versus strategic work. So another way to put this is, a program is not doing AppSec things, it's having and building an AppSec program. So one of the first issues that you may come across if you don't have an AppSec program and are just doing AppSec things is the burden that you place on the engineering aspect. So by not having a program, your security activity work is generally going to be delegated to engineers who are performing like quote unquote heroics and like taking this work on themselves, even though it's not necessarily their job role. Where in contrast with the program, the expectations for what the engineers are doing and dedicated application security people might be doing are much more clear, and there's a somewhat of a split between those two roles. Another concern or another positive aspect of having a program is that coverage for the security activities you are performing would be consistent and applied across the SDL. So things like training in the early stage, as well as security activities in the later stage, like maybe penetration tests. And without a program, you don't have someone managing that perspective from a top level, so how you're applying those efforts are not really consistent, or they may be like lumped into a particular section or a particular stage of the SDL. Another negative part of not having a program is the growth and maturity of the program may not be well defined. Since you were only focusing on tactical efforts, there's no clear growth or horizon for what the program will eventually mature and become, and it's just little pockets of improvement. Another key difference can be seen, as I mentioned earlier, in SDLC coverage. If the AppSec work is too narrowly focused, the activities that are performed are much more likely to be later stage, where addressing any issues identified are going to be much more costly. And then finally, the work that a program would identify would ideally be doing efficient and purpose-driven work, as opposed to having the wrong tool for the job or doing lots of things that make some progress but maybe aren't the best way to do it. So another key aspect of security maturity is this concept of just having metrics about what you're doing. So a very common first pass at AppSec metric would be vulnerability counting. So, as previously I was a consultant before joining Duo, and a very common question that you get doing a closeout call with clients as a consultant is, how many bugs did we find this time versus last time we did this? That is, of course, a valuable metric, but in and of itself is not a good representation of how effective your AppSec program is. So, for example, if there was a lot of bugs found during some security assessment, it could be that the scope of your program is too narrowly focused on security assessment work versus, say, training developers. So whether or not that the people found bugs is not necessarily suggestive of positive or negative things, it's just a data point. On the other hand, finding no bugs could say that, or could suggest that whoever's doing the application security work maybe doesn't have the right capabilities, or maybe their focus is misguided, or maybe the scope of the work they're doing was just too tight and they couldn't actually complete some sort of effective activity. So bug counting is not necessarily bad per se, it's just a common first pass that's just a single data point. Whereas with the program, you could have programmatic basis for several focus areas. For example, what's our timeline for security defect resolution? How long does it take us once we receive a vulnerability report, either from an internal or external party? What's the timeline between that report and us shipping patches to production? Or maybe you could focus something along the lines of how your AppSec program is interfacing with the quality assurance team, and asking questions like, what percentage of code bases have security integration tests? So metrics like these are obviously useful, but an effective program would be gathering much more metrics than this. And you could, if you were starting a new program, start from scratch and try to sit down with a bunch of people and brainstorm metric after metric. But thankfully, there are actually maturity models that exist that can help define these processes. So the two most prominent maturity models for security programs are going to be BSIMM and SAMM. We can see that visually they're kind of easy to get a hold on. They have about 4 higher level categories that cover a section of like security practices. And so, for example, governance as a function in both may cover gathering metrics, training and education, as well as policy and compliance related AppSec activities. So just looking at things though from this perspective, they look quite similar, and I don't think like their differences or similarities are well captured. So digging in a little bit deeper, we can see that they're still quite similar, but they've been in use for about a decade. They've been fairly recently updated, so they're still actively being worked on. And as I mentioned earlier, the number of top-level groupings and activities are in the same ballpark. The one key difference between these two programs, though, is the basis for the model that they've made for, or how they define the model. So the basis for BSIMM is based on real-world data from Synopsys, who was a consulting firm that's collected lots of metrics on 100+ organizations and has a sense of what the industry is actually doing. On the other hand, SAMM is a community-based model that has been described by community contributors that define like what an ideal state looks like. So in other words, you could say that BSIMM is descriptive and SAMM is prescriptive. So taking a specific activity that is shared across both. Code signing, for example. The BSIMM section describes what industry organizations in industry are doing related to code signing. This abstracts out a lot of details. It shaves off maybe minor changes across different organizations. But all in all, it's just describing what's actually being done. SAMM, on the other hand, is defining what a code signing process might look like if you were to implement it in an organization. So it describes things like when it's appropriate, when it's not. So it gets a little more into the details, but it's actually not talking about what the organizations actually do. So as I mentioned, BSIMM and SAMM do have similarities, but I think the most important aspect of the biggest takeaway from these differences is these models are both useful in their own ways. And if you were going to adopt these models, you want to have some sense of like both real world data and what is the ideal state, as well as understanding that these models are not necessarily checklists. What they are is like a foundation to build a program upon. So since neither of them are about your organization as unless you're in the BSIMM data set, none of them are about your organization. You may have to account for organizational growth or contextual differences between, say, the organizations in BSIMM's data set and your organization. So all in all, these models should be adapted upon when they're implemented in an org. So before we get into how we built our program, it might be helpful to provide some context on what like Duo's security organization looks like today. So Duo's security story is a bit more complex than, say, just an AppSec team. So we interface as the AppSec team with several other security teams, like, for example, product R&D, who would be defining and developing proof of concepts for new product features. So right from the get-go, we have an entire team dedicated to, entire team of security experts dedicated to developing new product features with a security mindset. So that's very useful for us because we have defined team that's doing security-related work from the very beginning. That's not necessarily our team. Another team that we might leverage is the data science team, which, for example, could provide valuable insights on what kind of features are in use across our customers, where maybe if we're in an incident response scenario, we can gather some of that information about customer feature usage and determine more factors or how we want to quantify risk for a particular incident. So what this all means is, as an AppSec team, we are not the sole we're not the sole security team within Duo's organization. So we really get to hone in on application security work at Duo with having other teams support us. Another thing that we'd like to point out is we do encourage rotations between these teams. So teams moving from, say, product R&D to data science can provide some context or a different perspective than they would normally provide in a different team. So it allows us to diversify and get extra perspectives on different security aspects of the organization. Driving in a little bit deeper, we can take a specific BSIM stat about the size of the software security group, which is the group of individuals who are responsible for software security within an organization, and see how many individuals are on that team versus the team that is producing software. So in BSIM 8's data set, which is about 109 organizations, for every 100 engineers, there are 1.6 software security group members. In contrast, with the most conservative estimate of what would be a software security group at Duo, which we're just defining to be the AppSec team, we have about 8.3 AppSec engineers per 100 and AppSec people per 100 engineers. So all in all, that's pretty good. We're happy about that number, but I think the big takeaway is this is not the number we want. We actually want to strive for about 10% coming into the beginning of 2018. And if you're interested, we're definitely hiring across multiple roles. So if you want to contribute to that ratio increase, you should definitely reach out. So another key aspect of our application security program is our application security team values. So it's important what we actually do on the day-to-day, but our team values guide how we want to approach those activities or our interfaces with engineers. So our first value is engineering is family. So as a job role, AppSec is inherently adversarial, but we have no intention of coming along just dunking on engineers and then leaving them in a cloud of backboard dust. We want to actually be empathetic to them and understand hey, if we are giving you a bug, this means that there's possibly extra work that you have to do. And so we want to make sure that as an AppSec team, we understand that relationship and we're always empathetic and empowering engineers to do their job effectively. I think another important aspect to engineering family is drawing a very smart line on where engineering might know best. So for example, as a person who reports bugs to engineering, I put a lot of effort into never saying things like, this should be an easy fix, or this is an easy fix, because I, as the person that didn't build it, am kind of defining what easy is for the people that did build it, and I could improve what I'm saying and say something along the lines of I think this can be addressed simply with X, Y, and Z. What do you think? Just small things like that. We want to make sure that we really get right. Our second value is low friction, high value. So as a team, it's easy for us to come up with solutions to problems that have no regard to how engineering actually operates. So low friction, high value says that we should do our due diligence to prioritize solutions that affect engineers in minor ways. So we're not going to be ineffective whatever this person is doing with that jar of pickles. We want to provide work and value in everything that we do, and we don't want to slow engineering down. And on the point of slowing engineering down, our third core value is build a paved road. So just like guardrails may guide a car from, say, driving off the road while it's barreling down a freeway, that's what we want to do as an AppSec team for engineering. So we want to empower engineers to act quickly and with confidence, and we want to make sure that if there are if there are tasks that we can provide, like frameworks or tooling or answer in any way, like the Duo AppSec recommended way, we can provide that for engineering. So we do not want to be like a sign-off machine for every single code diff that comes down, because that's going to slow us down. We're not going to be able to work on hard problems, and that's going to slow engineering down because we're now a blocker for everything that they're doing. Our next core value is how could it go right? So it's very easily for an AppSec team to become a no team or a anti-feature team. And so instead of being a team of no, we want to approach application security with the engineering mindset and embrace difficult engineering challenges. So we don't want to doomsay. We'd rather steer potential features down a path that maximizes not only security, but say functionality. We don't want to put any sort of contention between security and product. And then our final value is no code left behind. We want to make sure that the volume of code that's coming out of engineers, we want to ensure that we're not forgetting existing code that was written several years ago. So whatever testing procedures that we come up with or however we define our program, we want to ensure that our security testing accounts for this not so shiny code. And with that, we'll turn it over to Mark, who's going to talk about our application security program and its implementation.
Cool, thanks, Kelby. So you guys are caught up now on BSIM and SAMM and kind of the differences and benefits between the two. Where we kind of come into this is we see value in both. And we know from the perspective of, let's say, an auditor coming in, they're going to know what BSIM is, they're going to know what SAMM is, they're going to know how to look at a maturity model and work with us. It kind of is one of those things where we want the best of both worlds and we're being a little bit greedy. And so what we actually created is what we call the Duo Application Security Maturity Model, or DASM. DASM's a cool name, so backronymed into that. And effectively what we do is we take the two maturity models, we condense them and consolidate them in roughly a kind of a similar structure, breaking out the activities, still having 4 high-level groupings, still having a lot of subgroupings. And so what that allows us to do is taken the basically the backend data set, and then we actually measure in BSIM and we measure in SAMM. So if someone says, hey, I only know what BSIM is because Gary McGraw said I should know what it is, we can show them that data set and we can give them that data real world. For us, we want to customize. We might have activities or controls that we want to track that are completely separate. And the nice part about SAMM is we can track those internally and then try to influence SAMM over time to say, hey, we find value in tracking this. We think this should be part of the next SAMM release, for instance. And this lets us do that. In terms of coverage and priority, we actually take the SAMM coverage kind of metric, if you will. And you can read the different kind of definitions up there and a little bit of a spreadsheet breakout down there. But effectively what we do is we have a unique identifier that spans both BSIM and SAMM. So we consolidate that world and we pull together both data sets into one horizon. We score all of it. We provide coverage for that metric. We provide a prioritization that is not to say like P1s will always be done first, but you should have some sense of like, oh, these things are important, or these things link together, or there's a dependency chain. If we don't do this P1, we can't do that P2 later, right? And so we track all this data. We do it quarter over quarter. We track progress. We decide, are we moving the needle the way we want to? And we can always abstract out new controls or new activities, and it doesn't influence the backend data. It influences just the abstracted view that we're tracking. So we this is something that we conveyed early to our engineering team when we did this, which is there's a lot of benefits for us. Ultimately, this is not something that engineers have to know the ins and outs of our maturity model. We own that. We track it. We do what we know we should be doing, and then some of that obviously impacts engineers, hopefully in a positive way. But ultimately, it's not a thing that they have to scan this spreadsheet like every day to know what's going to happen next. Similar to what Kelby had said before, we don't treat this as a checklist. This isn't everything has to be everything's a P1 and everything's a coverage of 1, which is 100% basically. That's not realistic. So we take it in kind of broad strokes. To Kelby's other point, we really don't like the mandatory rigid sign-off process that a lot of companies institute. So some of the maturity model statements about, sign-offs at every stage of so-and-so, we actually put that as like a priority 4, like we just aren't gonna do that. We have structures and check processes, but not like horribly like latent sign-off processes. So the abstraction helps us, it helps with compliance needs, it helps internal communication, it helps provide a standardization of the maturity model of the activities we're doing, and it also lets us keep up with, as BSIM 7 to 8 just happened. We can update for that. If SAMM 1.5 to whatever the next version of SAMM will be, we can update to that. So it gives us some flexibility and allows us to customize as needed. We check the metrics. We make sure that we actually have progress that we were intending. And overall, it just gives us a little bit more control of our own destiny. In addition to the overarching maturity model, then you get into a little bit more of the weeds of how we do these things, where we're gaining efficiencies. And one place we gain efficiencies is we try pretty desperately not to reinvent the wheel. We don't think we're going to come up with like the best risk methodology. We don't think we're going to come up with the best vulnerability prioritization and scoring methodology. So we leverage industry standards. Some of these are open source, like BugCrowd VRT, that we actually have pull requests into the GitHub for VRT to say, we don't think this is right. We think this should be this, right? So we have that. We have I was going to say tried and true and then say stride. That's not great. But stride and dread and things that a lot of us know. And then OWASP, ASVS, or obviously SAMM that we just spoke about. So we're trying to use the best of what the industry has to offer. We try to influence them, to change them if we think there's a deficiency that we can influence. But we don't want to spend our time coming up with like really novel things that don't really do a whole lot other than make us feel good about ourselves. Related to that, how we feel good about ourselves is actually building relationships, acting collaboratively, and making improvements across the board. And a lot of that is involved in making relationships with stakeholders, understanding the needs and wants of other teams. One big area that we've really put a lot of time into and has paid really massive dividends is our QA team. QA are basically like pen testers or AppSec engineers with a different outcome in mind, right? They're breaking stuff, they're putting weird inputs into fields, and they're getting a SQL bug. And when they see a SQL bug, they go, there's a SQL bug. We should fix the SQL bug. We see it, we're like, SQL injection, right? Same thing, different side of the coin, right? And so we build a lot of relationship and empathy there. Product team, we spend time. If you think of the SDLC, we want to be before the SDLC. We want to be with our product team and influencing the things that we know are going to be a problem by the time an engineer gets it in their hands. And we can cut that off and say, this idea is great, let's tweak it this way. And now when the engineer goes to implement it, we'll be more successful. So we can proactively and for very cheaply influence these things in a positive way early. And then lastly, a lot of support of compliance, making sure the things that our customers ask of us are accurate and correct. Assessments for SOC 2 or PCI or FedRAMP, supporting those initiatives to make sure they're successful for the business. Content, we are presenting today, so you can check that one off that we're not lying to you. Blog post content, white papers, all the kind of standard stuff there. As I mentioned, contributing to standards when we're able to do so. Community events, running conferences. I just ran a conference in Michigan where I'm from. Security research is a thing that all of us do and focus on. And then even public policy reform for things like DMCA or relevant issues that impact application security engineers and researchers. So to us, we think in terms of engineering as, if you didn't get from our values, like we take this very seriously on how we're building this relationship. And for us, engineering is customer number one. We exist to support them and make them successful. We don't exist to find bugs and do cool things. We're here to make the business successful, and we do that by accelerating our engineers' success through thoughtful progress across the SDLC. And this is the kind of way we visualize a little bit of this, and work with me on this analogy for a sec. But if you're filtering water through, what you're really doing in the security development lifecycle is you're trying to put a lot of time and effort in your input, right, at a very broad level. So things like training engineers how to write secure code, that if you have your audience, that scales very well. Versus if you get down farther in the verification stage, that would be like doing an AppSec assessment or like a pen test on that code base. It takes a lot of our time. It can take a lot of their time. If we find a pervasive bug or vulnerability class throughout that code base, the amount of refactoring there could be extremely expensive. So it's a very lossy, expensive process. And then if we get to the bucket, the handle looks like a smiley face in my opinion. You'll not unsee it now. The response is extremely, extremely hard to deal with. It's all of the product security advisory process. It's working with security researchers. It's understanding legal implications. It's a very, very unfortunate place to have to be for any company. And what we want to do is we want to put focus at the start of the SDL so that we get the benefits throughout and hopefully lessen and lessen and lessen what's actually going through there. So engineering-focused security, in terms for us, is if we think about the far side of the SDL, and we think about training, we have a number of initiatives that we've really spearheaded to live what I'm explaining today. One is that every single engineer that starts at Duo actually fills out a security interest and skills survey. So we say, hey, what languages are you writing at Duo? Did you have collegiate courses in information security and secure coding? Did you work in a highly regulated industry that might have more specific restrictions on certain languages or libraries that you had to use? And we try to gain all this information so that we are actively supporting the population that we're there to support. We are not just doing what we feel like doing. We are taking real-world data from every engineer, and that influences how we do our job. This isn't what we want, this is what they need. DevD is basically something where we will go to either large team meetings or small team meetings, talk about a vulnerability class, but talk about how it impacts our product, maybe not in a real bug, but in a hypothetical bug. Hey, this, we use a lot of Python, and if you do this thing with the serialized object, this could go bad, right? We give real-world examples from public bugs that have come out from researchers or in the news, and actually explain what that means to them as an engineer and how we as a company can mitigate against that risk. Hands-on, we just had a special guest from a company come in and give a presentation to all of our engineers about security. We are actively developing training courses that we control the content of and present to our engineers on a regular cadence to make sure everyone's kind of like baselined. And then finally, fun things to do. This holiday season, we're going to be doing a Elevation of Privilege card game tournament as a way to teach people about threat modeling and get them excited and throw some gift cards at them. But just different ways. I think if you talk a lot of people that do training, you want bite-sized, you want formal, you want this, you want that. You want to mix up how people learn because everyone learns differently. But more than just learning differently, we also want to be dynamic in how we're teaching for the fact that the same mindset that we use as kind of attackers, we can help people get more into the mindset we are. It's not perhaps a unique thing, but you have to take time to explain it to certain people, and then they're like, oh, I see what you're doing. You're doing this bad thing that no one would expect you to do. Yeah, that's basically our whole job. So it's something that you can help guide people on. So the next 4 things we'll talk about in brief are just when we deliver to our engineering team, we actually deliver what we consider like security activities or security services. These services go across the SDL. So after we get past training, we get into like software, right? One thing we'll do is security design reviews. We will sit down with a specification, a architecture diagram, scribbling on a whiteboard and start walking through some of the properties that we as AppSec are concerned about if they were to build the software they're thinking of or to refine the software they're looking at. This is all early stage, so it's very cheap. It's conversations, it's a little bit of time in a room, and these things will influence the entirety of the development of that software, and so we can make a big impact very early and luckily miss out on a lot of the nitpicky stuff later that's harder to refactor. And so we have different deliverables for each of these, and you can take a look at those. Threat modeling is something that we decouple from design review. Some people might group the two together. We see these as different things, primarily because for threat modeling, we want it to be an evolution where we do the design review kind of in the general, more abstract sense in many cases, and then once we get a little bit more like, okay, this service will do this thing on this port and send this kind of data, in a JSON blob like this, and we want to have a little bit more of the primitives of how this software will work to do a threat model, so that we can get into, okay, we see you're going to use this here, we'd recommend you use this instead. And it gives us a little bit more to grasp onto, and we can enumerate threats and actually talk about this is how a bad thing would happen in the current threat model we're looking at of this design that we're reviewing. So the other thing is we decouple these things because we want it to be iterative. We don't want to come into a design that's like fully baked and then try to do a threat model and blow this thing apart and then have them to go completely back to the drawing board. We want to stagger it so that we can intercede at each step and make their lives easier ultimately. Code auditing, this is something that is pervasive through many parts of that whole, okay, we got the design, we did the threat model, we understand the risk, we understand the mitigations. Now we actually have to write code in Vim, right? And so once we get there, this is something that we encourage people early and often come to us. Hey, I'm re-implementing TLS in this thing. Okay, you should come to us immediately. Hey, I'm concerned about this thing that I'm taking user input into anything. Let's talk about that now. And so we'll do code diff review. We'll look at entire features. We'll look at four-line diffs. It doesn't matter. What we want to do is be available to our engineers so that, again, they're spending less and less time and getting more and more value. Security assessment is security assessment or pen test or however you want to maybe phrase that. This is either a major feature release like pre-production stage where we've done code auditing, we've done the threat models, we've done the design reviews. This is the latter stage of this. And what we hope versus I think what a lot of the industry looks at is when we get here, we should have very little surprises. This should be like, oh yeah, that one feature, we knew that might, Whereas a lot of organizations get here and they're like, okay, let's see what we did over the last 2 years and hope it's okay. So for us, this is like the holistic review of everything, all the artifacts, all the work that we put in to realize that value and the savings at that point. And so this is something that we usually have good success with our engineering teams, and they appreciate that we really have one final step or one major step that checks all our work along the way. And then finally, response. If we do have a vulnerability in our product, whether that's a third party reporting us or us finding one, we want to handle that in a very transparent and responsible way. So one thing that we are currently doing, first the organization has the first draft of their PCERT framework, and we're actually going to standardize on the PCERT framework. That was recently in an RFC period. We gave feedback during the RFC period and waiting for it to kind of finalize. But we do use some of the popular ISO standards that have Katie Mastouris helped champion when it comes to how we actually do our advisory process and with our customers and the public. All those advisories are published on our website in perpetuity, so people can see what issues we had over time, which is important. And then also, if people do reach out to us, we have a full, hey, this is how to contact Duo. We want you to contact us. Here's our email. Here's our GPG key. Please let us know what you found. We'd love to hear more. And Adam Goodman will be speaking tomorrow at noon in this room, actually, about a case study around our advisory process and our response workflow. So please check that out. And this is a little diagram. We've had, I think 15 published product security advisories from 2014 until today. No one submitted a bug right now. I'm busy. But if you look at it, this is the number of days from when we understood a vulnerability occurred or knew about the vulnerability, right? Whether we found it or someone submitted it, to the time of the PSA release. So very often the PSA release comes even after the patch is out, because we want to get the patch ready, we want to distribute it to like customers and all that, and then release it. So over time, and 15 data points is 15 data points, right? Not that we want a ton more, but the trend line's going in the right direction. We're getting a little bit faster over time, which is good. We think things like the PCERT framework and other initiatives will actually help even further. And as our AppSec team maturity grows, we should be able to speed that number up to remediation time and release even better. So how do we organize? This is kind of the overall flow chart. We help people in the organization in two ways. One is what we consider like easy mode. And that easy mode would be quick things, come to, ping us on Slack, come to our desk, hang out with us at our opportunities when we're in the same room and ask us questions. And that covers a lot, and it also starts really good and productive conversations. Conversations we would have never had if they didn't feel inclined to come talk to us. One of those opportunities, we run a weekly office hours, so people can come to us at a dedicated time with our entire team and sit down and start talking about things they're concerned about or interested about. We have had very substantial security conversations come out of just being available for people, and something that we're very proud of and have had a lot of return. And this realizes the low friction, high value in another example. They don't have to go through some convoluted process. They just walk in at this time on this day. We're going to the hard mode, we have a intake process. This is something that an engineer, an engineering manager, a product team manager can fill out. And it captures all the high-level intake data so that we can triage the request for what they need, why they need it, what the scope is, and really just get simple, bare-bone details out of the way. Once we have those, we can act intelligently and help them out. It's a very short process. It's been extremely effective at having people feel like they have a direct conduit that cuts out all of the intermediary concerns and questions. It's just one form, a few questions, and they're in the queue to have us help them in a very structured way. If they fill out this form, it doesn't mean that they actually want help from us. What it means is they want help from someone. And one thing that we publish, and this is a truncated version that we kind of just dialed up for today's presentation, but the sense here is we might not be the right party to do this. If, for instance, they need a report from a security firm for an auditor, that auditor probably will not take our internal report, right? They need a third party to do that work. And so we enumerate these properties. This is, again, like a piecemeal version, but we enumerate like 20 properties. And those properties influence what that engineering manager might ask us for, or if they ask us for our help or someone else's. And so it puts more knowledge in their head, and we are empowering them to ask for what they need from the right source at the right time. We have just a statusing board. Very simple. We kind of run things like an internal consultancy. We give an avenue. We project manage. We structure a backlog. We give statusing information along the way. We give links to the reports if we write them for the work we're doing. A lot of transparency. All engineers can see this all the time. This is not internal to us. This is a company level view of what we're working on. The intake process leads ultimately if we have to do some work for one of the teams to we kind of structure like a kickoff process, and that kickoff process has some checklist items. And this makes sure, did we get code access we needed? Did we get the documentation we needed? Do we have access to the dev environment we're going to test this on? It gets a lot of, again, the overhead out of the way so that we start on time, we do the work on time. If they have a deadline, we do not want to slow them down. In order to not slow them down, we have to be very upfront about what we need to be successful for them. And this checkoff, kind of process walks through that and makes sure that's true. Then Kelby and the rest of us just hack stuff and find bugs and whatever. Cover Homer and spiders or whatever, and then we enter a new workflow. So we have our overall process, and now we have our vulnerability handling. Got a report, and this could be an internal bug or an external bug, doesn't matter, the same workflow applies. We walk through this, and this is just the reality that once a bug, a security defect is found, that security defect could actually result in many tasks for the engineers. It could be a multi-team problem, it could be pervasive through other code bases, and so we handle that in a kind of structured way. One of the things that we do that is not unique, I've worked for organizations that do this, but when we do a major piece of like a security assessment or a threat model, we actually deliver a formal report. And we deliver it in the same way that you'd expect any security firm worth their salt to actually give you. We do this for these reasons up here, which you can take a look at. Ultimately, we find a lot of value in it. It's something that when you have new engineers and old engineers and new AppSec people and old AppSec people in the teams, a single bug in a defect tracking system is hard to really like holistically understand like what was the state of affairs at this point in time that this assessment happened. This report captures that. You can more easily look year over year. You can give this as an asset to compliance and auditors if they need proof that someone looked at this code base, and it helps a lot in general. So in conclusion, AppSec programs in general in any context, they're hard to do. And it's a dedication that you have to think, okay, we're not just gonna keep doing stuff, we're gonna stop, breathe, and think about how do we be successful? How do we build the foundation that's gonna get us where we want in 1 to 5 years, and not just, hey, we gotta do a pen test this quarter. And so it's not easy for everyone to do that. We realize like whether it's budget, staffing, that's a hard thing by itself. But someone should really focus on it. Build the relationships with engineering, with QA. You need them to be successful in any regard. We are here to make engineering successful, not the other way around. And there's a lot to do. Get a maturity model, focus on it, score it, and you will see a growth pattern, whether that's actually a growth pattern or a regression, but you will know where you stand, and you will know where you need to go, hopefully. And lastly, we're doing some stuff in 2018 and looking ahead, that team ratio we talked about, more training, better sense of software inventory dependencies and all that, a lot of continuous automation testing, and hopefully to be in the community more and see all your smiling faces at other events. So we're out of time. There's our contact information. Please reach out if you'd like to talk more about our program or what we're up to. Thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it.